Hi, I'm Linda Moulton Howe, reporter and editor of earthfiles.com, a news website that I have been doing since 1999 on science, environment, and real X-Files. I have been trying to get to the bottom of the UFO secret for 43 years and all of its many, many facets that are so complicated. And I am so grateful to have a lifetime achievement by the Parapod to come to Santa Clarita and meet many of you and be able to talk in a setting in 2023 in which we will be able, I hope, to talk about UFOs and ETs in a straightforward and honest way, while the government of the United States and other nations have classified reality. And I'm here to try to unclassify reality so that we all can share in the truth that the power brokers of this planet have known for centuries.
This is Truth Be Told.
That not only are there reptilians here,
new evidence of UFO fleets.
We were close to nuclear war.
To help you transform so that you can live your highest truth.
We're not being told just because we're not ready for it.
Geostations of frequency, vibrational.
I was a homicide detective with LAPD.
UFOs increase. Visitations. When you hear the name Aleister Crowley, we think of magic, occultism, as he is one of the most famous in this genre. And today we have Tobias Churton on the show talking about his latest book, Aleister Crowley in Paris, Sex, Art, and Magic in the City of Light. We will explore how Crowley was initiated into the Golden Dawn's inner order, and even being expelled from Italy by Mussolini. I'm a big history buff, but I'm also a fan of magic. Tobias is a leading scholar of Western esotericism, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Freemasonry, and Rosicrucianism. Well, we have lots to talk about, so I'd like to welcome to the studio author of the book, Aleister Crowley in Paris, the one and only Tobias Churton. Hello, hello.
Hello, Tony. Very good to speak to you tonight.
I know. Well, you don't sound like you're from the South, like Georgia. So it sounds like it sounds like you might be over the pond, as they say.
I'm over the pond in merry England. Yes.
Well, thank you for zooming in from. I know it's later in the evening there, but. I just had my lunch, so I'm all set and ready to go.
Right.
Well, so I'm going to show the people the latest book. I love, first of all, I love the artwork of this book, and you have several books about Aleister. And could you first explain? I'm curious why so many books about this amazing historical figure.
Yes, well, you've just said it. He's an amazing historical figure. And I have to say that when I first began my interest, he was so amazing that nobody I knew had ever heard of him, right. Including me. And it's one of those great stories that's been suppressed, or a great record that no one's ever heard. And this is the sixth volume and the completed volume, the last volume of my biography of Crowley. And Winston Churchill, had an 8-volume biography written of him by Martin Gilbert, which I was very fond of and impressed by. And I felt that Crowley's life was so fascinating that he deserved more than these single-volume jobs, right. which simply don't encompass the extraordinary character of this man. Even Jesus has 4 gospels after all, and quite a lot of other gospels that would right. like to claim that title. So I think when you've got an extraordinary individual coming into this world, they're worth as many angles on the person as you can get. If you look at a movie and you've got a movie star, they're not just shot from the front up in one scene. You have to see them in many scenes relating to many people and from all kinds of angles. And I think a great biography should accomplish this. It should show the person in many settings and amongst many different people, and until you get a fully rounded picture. The Earth didn't look like the Earth until we saw it from outer space. Right. We finally got a rounded picture at last, and it's been very influential. And it's hard to believe after seeing the Earth from outer space that people would be still behaving like cavemen. But there we go. There are no limits to our knowledge, and there seem to be no limits to our ignorance.
Right. Well, I might take that part of the ignorance on it.
We're all ignorant, but we're all looking to know. What I loved about Aleister Crowley the first time I started to encounter him was that this was a man who truly wanted to know what life was really all about. What's going on? He'd been brought up. Edward Alexander Crowley, born 1875 in a very nice provincial English town called Leamington Spa, by parents who in some ways were exemplary insofar as that they lived a comfortable life and extremely moral life, but they had joined a fundamentalist Christian sect called the Plymouth Brethren, and their only son, poor Edward Alexander Crowley, Aleister was a pen name he used for his writings, but he was christened Edward Alexander after his father. Alexander, by the way, means helper of men, and I'd like people to think that that's an aspect of Crowley. He was brought up in a very narrow-minded viewpoint, unless, of course, you fully embrace the idea that the King James version of the Bible is the inerrant truth about everything. And there's his mother, I see, Emily Bertha Crowley. She was he couldn't get on with his mother very well. He never thought she was quite cut the mustard as far as he was concerned. His father was a Plymouth Brethren preacher, and this was a sect which had begun in Ireland in the shortly before the middle of the 19th century, and their view was that the Church of England had absconded from the true faith and had embraced too many liberal ideas. And if only people would understand that every single word of the Bible was literally true as it read, everything would be absolutely fine. So Crowley was brought up in an exclusive situation where he wasn't allowed to mix with children who were not part of his parents' faith and church. He was sent to schools where he was tortured for not confessing his sins. He had a really quite repressive background, and very naturally, as he was a spirited and highly intelligent child, he rebelled. He didn't really rebel until his father left this world when he was 11. And at that his father died of cancer, and he might not have died because he had advice from the royal physician. Had it not been for members of the church saying, "Oh, no, you must try this new method of electro things." Will somehow they put things in him which sent electric currents. Anyway, of course, he died. He died of cancer, and he was left in the clutches of his mother, who was a slightly lower class than his father, and her brother. I mean, this is quite Dickensian. Uncle Tom Bishop, who ran various church societies, and they tried to persuade him that it was his duty to follow the beliefs of his father, which in some ways he'd like to have done. He loved his father, but he didn't trust the mother and her brother, who took over. And he started to pursue his own interests. And these interests, he was recommended to the University of Cambridge by the Prime Minister at the time. And he went to Cambridge. And from that, when he was about 20, he came into his fortune and became totally independent. And he used his independence to explore every aspect of spiritual knowledge that he could find. He was particularly interested in magic because magic was and all that goes with it, the whole Gnostic conception of an inner or esoteric truth, seemed to him to have been suppressed, and certainly wasn't something he'd been brought up with. And he took it to the limits. That's sort of But meanwhile, I mean, while he was educating his mind and his soul, he was also a superb mountaineer, and one of the greatest mountaineers in England, in the world, in fact, and virtually founded aspects of the sport. He was an adventurer. His big hero was Sir Richard Burton. Who was the first person to go to Mecca and get away with it as undisguised, but reliant on his knowledge of languages. And he went to Mecca did the full Hajj, got away without being. He should have been, of course. He would normally have been. Anyone who tried that would normally have been killed as an infidel. And Richard Burton was a highly independent thinker who recognized that sex was a natural and important part of life, whereas Crowley had been brought up to believe that it was all part of the sin of being in the body and something to be feared and rejected, because human destiny was simply to get yourself a front row seat in heaven. If you could, but of course, a back seat would be better than hell.
Right.
So he had a sort of a Victorian upbringing, but Crowley had an extraordinarily modern mind, and that's why I think people are starting to relate to him. And I don't know if it was that brought me to Crowley. I just recognized in him a romantic figure. I was interested in mountaineering myself at the time. That's when I first heard his name. I went along to a meeting of the Oxford Mountaineering Society when I first went up to Oxford, heard about his name in the context of mountaineer Chris Bonington, who said he was one of his heroes. The next thing I knew, my dear friend George said, "Hey, have you ever read this?" And he had this book called The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, and he lent it to me over Christmas. And I read it, and I hadn't read very many books that were as well written and as penetrating and hyper intelligent as the book I was reading. And I was knocked aside because I'd gone to Oxford on the basis that I was going to be a priest in the Church of England. And I was introduced through this book to something that was much closer to my heart, which was to be simply a spiritual being. And what I found through the writing was a far clearer statement of the distinctions between an earthly, puerile and mediocre life and a life which was inspired. And then as time goes on, you find out other people have been so inspired. John Lennon particularly was inspired by Crowley. Mentioned his doctrine in his last interview with Newsweek in 1980. Wow. And of course, David Bowie and many of these culture figures of our generation and the generation before us have been touched by this spirit of freedom, which I know that the Jimmy Swaggarts would prefer to think had all come from Satan.
Yeah.
As something evil and disruptive. I think the trouble with, obviously, there is a problem with presenting these subjects. They are esoteric. They require a certain amount of understanding, and if they're sold cheaply, yes, they become simply a license to be yet another of life's difficult prats. You know, I don't know if you have that word in America, prat. It means somebody is
just a last name.
doesn't know what they're doing and causes a lot of problems for everybody else. Spiritual material has always been divisive and difficult, and that's the nature of it, because it challenges our philosophy or conception of what life is about. That is true of all serious philosophy. You're trying to raise man from this sort of eating, drinking, sleeping level to a conception of existence which takes us to the stars and beyond. That is not going to be ever acceptable to people who make their money from eating, sleeping, drinking, and public conveniences. You know?
Right.
If you're earthbound, the kinds of things I'm talking about will simply be either offensive or irrelevant, and that's always been the case. But you're running a show, obviously you're interested in these things.
Well, I'd like to go back a little bit, because you said that you were actually looking to become a priest. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I certainly have a spiritual vocation. Yes, but
I know with England, just history-wise, the Church of England, and Catholic, many lives were lost because one didn't follow the other, and so going into wanting to become a priest and then learning about Aleister, that's a complete different direction. And how did that conflict with your own beliefs, and when did it kind of make sense?
Very interesting you say conflict. I remember at one point I had a flat in Lichfield, and I had two bookcases, and on the left side was Aleister Crowley and all my books on Gnostic philosophy and Gnostic Gospels, and on the other was sort of books about history and conventional theology. And I always thought, well, if I could bring these together, I'd have achieved something. But they always stay a bit apart, don't they? And I knew that I couldn't let one go for the sake of the other.
Right.
I knew that there was wisdom in all these avenues, and I would rather be a reconciler myself than somebody who simply becomes embittered with rejection. I have personally many reasons to feel bad about the conventional church, the Church of England, that I was brought up with. But I think one should never let that get the better of you. You must always go for a higher synthesis.
Right.
So it was a difficult struggle, and I was the chaplain of my college at Oxford, Brasenose College, Oxford, tried to get rid of me. There was a kind of group who just
did they really? Wow.
Oh yeah. They, why are we? When it was, they'd realized that I wasn't going to be corralled into being a conventional religious teacher and conform. They tried various means to get me out of the college. It was a terrible struggle and very difficult for a young man, and rather innocent in some ways. I'm 19, 20 years old, to deal with. It was quite horrendous. But I stuck with it, and I did get through, and I sat my degree, and I got it, and then I still wanted to be a priest, so I went to the Church of England. I think 3 times I took my vocation to the Church of England, and each time I had this curious rejection. I say curious because from an educational and theological point of view, it was insane to turn me down, and who were they employing? But I was very romantic about religion. I thought it was to do with the absolute truth and doing God's will on earth and all the rest of it. And what I found was that all churches are extremely human.
Yeah.
Yes. And they love the idea that God became man because it puts God on their level.
Right. Yes.
That is the real pitfall of the incarnation idea.
Yeah.
God becomes man. I think Athanasius said God became as we are so we could be as he is. Well, I think most churches only remember the first part. They like the idea that he's on our level because that means that he's listening to their kind of drivel.
Yeah. And if he could only talk back to them loud and clear.
I think we have to talk. We have to get to a divine level and communicate with spiritual truth.
Right.
And this isn't some cheap thing you can put up in a tent outside Nashville and say, come on, then now your sins will be forgiven.
Right.
I think it's important to have your sins forgiven, depending on the sin, I think.
Right.
but,
exactly.
You have to have a clean sheet to start. But this notion that there is some kind of easy way out of the human predicament simply by accepting Jesus. Jesus, they always,
hallelujah.
It's hallelujah, right? Without some fundamental spiritual change. Now, I also know that in the, as I say, the ordinary evangelical tradition is enormous sincerity and understanding of these things, but there's also a hostility to people who've taken a different path, and we have never got over culturally the Inquisition. The idea that there is a religious body prepared to condemn anything they fear,
right,
to an eternal lake of hell. Now that is an interesting thing. Crowley, of course, who we must get back to, was constantly his objection to Christianity, as he was brought up with, was this notion that all sinners should be in an eternal lake of fire. They should be eternally tortured. Eternally tortured. That was the doctrine of the church. It still is. They don't talk about it anymore, but that is actually the traditional doctrine of Christianity, that the sinners condemned at the judgment will be eternally tortured. People don't realize why it's eternal. It's not sadism, strangely enough. It's because of the doctrine that the soul is eternal, and therefore you can't destroy it. You can't condemn it to death. The only thing you could do is put it in a situation where it is, by its own nature, going to be eternally tortured. And Crowley said, this is the 20th century. Do we really, really believe that is right, to torture souls eternally, however much we may hate? Didn't Jesus also say, love your enemies, bless those who persecute you, pray for those who abuse you, and so on and so on? So Crowley's so-called Magick, with a capital K, was born out of a disappointment, to say the least, with conventional Christianity and a great search for a more profound truth. Now, that's the search that he went on. He traveled the world to do so. He went to the Far East. He went to India. He listened to what was being said. He embraced for a long time Buddhism, almost wholly. He was a very close friend of Alan Bennett, who was the first person to bring the Buddhist Sangha or community to England before the First World War. And he wanted really to be a Buddhist, but something in him revolted also against the Buddhistic estimation of the value of this life and the Buddhistic estimation of the individual. Crowley was a hell of an individual. He has a big personality.
Right.
It's not surprising that a lot of his doctrines are about how to deal with the ego. I mean, he had a huge ego. Absolutely. Because he'd had to create it to stop being destroyed by this. I was going to say
almost a protective. Yeah.
Yes, I think Israel Regardia, a dear, I wouldn't say a dear friend of his, but he worked for him for quite a few years. Said that he was surrounded by character armor, which is a sort of Freudian kind of expression.
Right.
He was surrounded by character armor. He had to defend himself. Actually, he was really quite a sensitive soul, but as life dealt him more blows, he developed a very thick skin, and was a very direct person. To me, why I have undertaken this lifetime's study of the man is because he was rejected so profoundly by Western culture in England and America. He belittled still today described as a Satanist, a person addicted to evil, sexual pervert, drug addict, all of these things. My own feeling was that, in fact, he's one of the great misunderstood people, and that the effort of trying to understand him, which I started to undertake in the 80s, and subsequently I had access to all his surviving private papers.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. Diaries, letters. And quite objectively, I found nothing psychotic, weird, criminal, dark, threatening. I never had. The only things that ever gave me nightmares about Crowley was when I read other people's books about him.
Not books that were against, like more spoke negative of him?
Yeah. There was, his first biographer who played a confidence trick on Crowley in his old age, who visited him in his late years when he was around 70, living in a boarding house, a sort of boarding house, rather nice place actually, in Hastings in Sussex. Became his literary executor. He's a young man called John Simons. And he dominated Crowley publications for many years after Crowley's death. Crowley died in 1947. And he wrote a biography which he thought would make his reputation. And he made a lot of money out of it for many years. It was called The Great Beast, which was a kind of nickname Crowley called himself. But the book presented a person who was sort of out of a kind of horror movie, really. And it was terribly tragic that his reputation fell into the hands of this particular talented writer. He's a good writer. His book was very readable, but very readable books are often very dangerous. If the
spoken ill will of the person, yes.
Yeah, and I felt that this biography was totally inadequate. And I wanted to do one out of a sense of justice and a sense that there was more to this man that was worth intelligent people's understanding. And he had a knack of solving some very fundamental problems of human existence and how we relate. Because he was he wasn't afraid to confront the big issues. There's a strongly existential aspect to Crowley. What's life really about? Are we kidding ourselves? Are we dead when we die? What are we? Why are we here? Is there any bloody point to all this?
Which we all ask.
Yeah, of course, all those things. He's confronting them, and he's saying there is a way. There is a way of being a free person, living with other people in freedom. And I think this idea of a system which has an ethical basis based on the principle that there is within us this potential for giving ourselves to our truest and deepest nature. I mean, in that sense, it's sort of Gnostic,
right?
But he had his own slant on that, and. Well, what can I say? People who discover Crowley, especially, I always find it tends to be slightly more intelligent people get it, because to reach that point, they've already struggled with some aspect of the world which is holding them back.
I think one time, I remember years ago, I'm just a curious person. I'm a Sagittarius, so I'm always seeker of truth, if that's what the definition of Sagittarius. And I remember interviewing a priest from the Church of Satan, and not necessarily I agree with the religion that they have, but I really got to understand at least this person's personality, and he was such a very well-mannered, well-spoken young man, and he spoke highly of the Church of Satan, about how they don't let anybody under 18 into the church. They don't recruit people. They raise money for the homeless. Listen, I know there's going to be people going, "Oh my God, Church of Satan," but I think sometimes our perception of people just because of their involvement in something we automatically put something negative over their heads. And it sounds like that is something that Aleister also went through. If you sat down probably with him, yes, you may have seen some ego, but like you got to see the innermost thoughts of his papers and diaries, you get to see truly who he was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Crowley has anything to do with the popular notion of Satan whatsoever.
Right.
Jesus was accused of getting his power from Satan. I mean, I think Crowley said something very profound. He said, Satan is the god of anyone you disapprove of.
Yes.
The Iranian Revolutionary Guard regard America as the great Satan.
Right.
Okay, so it's something they disapprove of, so they throw this word in. In other words, you don't have to listen to them because they're obviously evil, right, and they represent a contrary force to us, and we're the good guys, we're the righteous, we're the holy, we have the book, and all the rest of it. I mean, this play that goes on between human beings, calling each other names, is endless. And Crowley obviously got stuck in the middle of it because I think he was uniquely threatening because he brought sex back into religion. Mm-hmm. And for most people, sex and religion, even if they're quite religious, sex is sort of, well, we wouldn't, mention that in terms. For most churches, sex is sort of has to be put in a particular barrel or department. It has to do with children, doesn't it? Yes, and stable marriage, yes, and raising those children to go to heaven. Right, fine. Well, that's sex then. Right. So. As for the mechanics, ask your mother or father, right, or read discreetly, of course, a little book which will tell you exactly what to do. Right. Now, Crowley had travelled the East and was well aware that there has always been a tradition that, in fact, sex and the energies that are evoked by this have a religious and spiritual dimension. Now that was an idea which is so fundamentally threatening to certainly the Catholic tradition, obviously the Orthodox tradition, and certainly to the Protestant tradition. Mm-hmm. Sex was a kind of nasty thing that came in with being alive, but someday it would go. Because we know the angels don't do it. So for Crowley, the sexual bliss was a spiritual exaltation, and that aspect of his outlook, I think, was uniquely threatening, and that's why I don't think he will ever be accommodated. So many heretics, so many years later, poets. People who were very threatening in their time, Percy Shelley, I don't know, John Lennon, whatever. Eventually, they're brought in. They're accepted. Right. There are many such figures who were very. Lord Byron, obviously another classic, but eventually they find a nice way of. I mean, it's like John Lennon today. It's always imagine. As he actually said, do you think I walk around all day saying imagine? Right. These are kind of, these are, people are co-opted, especially when they're dead. The worst thing to do if you want the truth about you told is to die. Right, because you know. You can guarantee that after you're gone, they're going to either ignore your existence, of course, or tell a load of crap about what you really were. Crowley certainly suffered from that, but he's never been. One of the things I love about him is he's never been co-opted into the establishment. He's always well outside, and I'm glad. Because if inside is heaven, I don't want to be part of it. Right. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, like you said, you've written many books. This is the final book of the series. But what sets this time of Aleister's life apart from the others that you discussed in other books? I think I think it's not only the sixth, but personally, I have a feeling that it's probably the best, because it sets Crowley in a fascinating perspective that no one's ever presented him for, which is his involvement with the artistic, literary theatrical scene of Paris in a marvelous period. We're talking the end of the Belle Époque, the beautiful era. If you've ever seen the film Gigi, it was gorgeous clothes and beautifully colorful and still romantic. And nobody had seen World War, nobody had seen the atomic bomb, and nobody imagined, very few anyway, had imagined such things. And he comes in there as an explorer, as the person who's just got the closest ever to climbing K2, the second highest mountain in the world, without oxygen in 1902.
Wow.
And he arrives in Paris as a young man to be a guest of his dear friend at the time, Gerald Kelly, who was a painter learning to paint in Paris. And he's introduced into the world of Montparnasse and meets fabulous artists and people who later became very famous, and now many of them are only just being recognized, like Eileen Gray, who was an Irish artist who was in Paris at the time, and he became engaged to. Wow. And I think mine's the first biography to really tell that story of how he was engaged with this wonderful artist. She designed a house that Le Corbusier said was one of the greatest things he'd ever seen. And they exchanged thoughts on yoga and mysticism and magic. And she remembered him all her life. A personal memory. They were very close. He wasn't trying to get her into bed. He thought it was a spiritual relationship, and he wanted to keep it that way. He wrote poems about her, marvelous poems, actually. He wrote a lot of poetry in Paris. So he turns up. It was about his third or fourth visit to Paris, but I think the 1902, 1903 period is very rich and has never been covered ever in any book before. And I've gone into that in wonderful detail and managed to decipher a whole load of letters, which have always been a bit mysterious, because he was writing kind of Monty Python style shorthand. And he knew practically every artist of note at the time. His girlfriend, Nina Olivier, as he knew her, in fact became the wife of Gertrude Stein's brother, Leo Stein.
Oh, wow.
Leo Stein was the man who introduced the West to Picasso, to Matisse. Wow. He was the great collector. Gertrude, his sister, got a lot of the credit, but it was actually Leo Stein. He married Crowley's girlfriend, who was the model, Nina Olivier. and he's right there, right at the epicenter of the birth of the modern era. And he clearly cut an amazing dash. And the more I looked into his life in Paris, it was like Crowley was more into Paris than anything. He first goes there in 1900, and he'd been there as a boy on the way to the Alps, where he used to climb. And he doesn't leave until 1929, when there's a conspiracy against him with the connivance of the Minister of the Interior, André Tardieu, who was a supporter of French fascism. And he was in with a lot of reactionaries, and they wanted Crowley out.
Were they threatened? I mean, or why did they feel so strongly about expulsing him?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I go into. I managed to get access to the government papers.
Oh, wow!
Which I can't go into how they came about. That came about, but it's quite clear that once the matter was brought to the minister, André Tardieu's attention, as a person, Crowley's whole reputation, they immediately thought he's a German agent.
Oh.
Because he when he was in America between 1914 and 1919, he'd infiltrated the German propaganda unit in New York. And that's another story that's in the other volume, which is Aleister Crowley in America, which is a great fat and juicy volume. Anyone interested in Crowley in America, that's the place to go. So a lot of that background is explained there. But they didn't know what they were dealing with Crowley. So the moment there was a complaint brought by the sister of his secretary, who was a nice Jewish girl from Washington D.C., who didn't like the fact that her brother Israel Regardie had gone over to Paris to be his secretary because she'd read some things of Crowley's writings and they were about sex, and she was terribly upset about this and complained to the American ambassador in Paris, and he drew the matter to the Minister of the Interior's attention, and they concocted this idea that he was some kind of moral debased figure who needed to be got rid of. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. The next thing is he's working for the British Special Branch. He's brought over to England and is advising the interface between MI5 and Special Branch on all sorts of matters. Very extraordinary story. I mean, there was always this aspect of he was very interested in secret services and things like that, and he did his job as an intelligence asset. Unfortunately, that kind of work requires that no one really knows who you are. Is he double agent, single agent, triple agent, whatever? And anyway, the French thought, I don't know what's going on here. Best get rid of him. And they didn't expel him as such. They just refused to renew his document of right to live there, which was called the carte de séjour. And there'd been a big thing in Paris at the time of getting rid of foreigners anyway, which was being promoted by the French Fascist League. And
oh my gosh,
so a lot of people were being ejected from Paris anyway. And they thought, well, what's one crazy Englishman who'd already been kicked out of Italy by Mussolini, which I'd have thought was a great dignity. But they must have felt some sympathy for Mussolini.
That's
let us not
shocker.
forget that when Hitler came into Paris in 1940, he had quite a lot of tacit French support and was able to leave half of France under the governance of the Vichy regime, who collaborated totally with Hitler and his anti-Jewish administration, and even shipped Jews from France without even being asked, volunteered. Send them to concentration camps in Germany. So, this was Europe in the 1920s and 30s. I don't know how different it is today. I think it's very different. But all this could happen again because human beings have not fundamentally changed. It's all about what information you get.
And that just it is kind of funny, not a ha-ha funny, but how we're supposed to learn history so we can prevent history, and
yes.
And for some reason we just we have very, 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 very short-term memory.
Yes, well, I think we all do. I mean, the trouble is it's a survival mechanism. We forget the pain.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
In our own lives, thank God. I mean, if you went to bed thinking about all the painful experiences you had, you would never sleep. And what tends to disturb your sleep is the thought that you might have more pain tomorrow. But if you can convince yourself that you're doing all right, the pain subsides and we naturally forget it. And as for history, well, of course, we have the convenient way of saying, well, it's all in the past, isn't it? And how many times have I heard this? I live for today. I live for today. Well, good, but today is the result of the past. And yes. And how many historical lessons are there to be learned from the past? There seems to be, it's almost impossible to compute. How much can you learn? If you're a fanatic, you focus on 2 or 3 things from the past that get you excited.
Right.
The Boston Tea Party, that's the important factor of the past.
Right.
But George Washington keeping slaves, that's not important.
Yeah.
He's a hero.
We're like, let's not talk about that. We'll talk about his wooden teeth. Well,
okay.
And just we have about 4 minutes left, and I hate to say that. I can't believe we're already almost.
I've talked too much.
No. Perfect. But do you think if Aleister lived today, he would be received completely different than he did back then, because especially here in California, there's a lot more people that are open to spirituality, magic, all kinds of different types of like the occultish type genre. What is your thoughts on that? How would
Well, he came to California, you see. He came to California several times. He talked about the cocaine crazed lunatics of Hollywood,
which that's probably still there, I'm sure.
And that was in 1919, right? So and of course, he knew about you had all the theosophical movement in California at that time. And America was full at that time of self-help groups of every kind, pseudo-occultists, people setting up. I think the people who've been most against Crowley, funnily enough, have not been really the churches, who haven't noticed. His greatest enemies tended to be the people who consider themselves authorities on magic, occultism, astrology, theosophy. So I don't think he'd be particularly welcome. I think they'd regard him as a disruptive influence. And he did have great following in California. I don't mean great in numbers, but his Californian followers were very keen, but there were only about a dozen of them. And they became the kernel of the modern Ordo Templi Orientis, which is active and doing well, I believe, in the United States and many countries. So no, I don't think. I think anybody who's. I think there's a great fear of intellectuals.
Yeah, for sure.
Generally speaking, because if they're any good. They make some people feel inferior, and they feel resentful, and they find little ways of getting back at them. Either they don't like their politics or something like that. Crowley's politics probably would cause a problem for some idealistic people, but they, on the other hand, if they saw him in the round, they might welcome the kind of plain speaking. But I think he'd still be a problem. Yes. Well, I think he'd still annoy people. A very good reason to read what he has to say, I think.
Well, I think people should read your book, Sex, Art, and Magic in the City of Light, Aleister Crowley, in Paris, by Tobias. Is it Churton?
Yes.
Perfect. I want to make sure I said it right. And people can go to your website and check out all your books, or you can pick it up on Amazon and pretty much anywhere their books sold. And how have people received your books when it apparently well enough to write so many, because his legacy is living on because of people like you, and I'm sure all of us appreciate that you have taken the time to give us the side of him that most people don't get to see.
Yes, I remember when I was first studied this whole subject of magic. I read in a book that the study of Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, which has a magical aspect, is worth a lifetime study. And I read this when I was 18 or 19, and I thought, a lifetime study, I'm doing a 3-year course at Oxford. I mean, 3 years, it seems long enough.
Right.
What's this? Well, lifetime study stuff, lifetime. My God, nothing could be worth that. Well, what I found is, in fact, if you really want to acquaint yourself with the depth of understanding, yes, a lifetime isn't enough.
We'll take it on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Well, Tobias, thank you.
Not that long.
Yeah, right. Well, Tobias, thank you so much for being part of Truth Be Told, and I hope to have you back again. Are you working on any new books and any new?
Oh, yes.
Any new characters for us?
Yes. Well, in the fall, I've got my study of alchemy.
Oh.
The First Alchemists, which is, I'm hoping, will be a standard work of exactly what alchemy was at the point it emerges in history, and it's controversial, I hope.
I'm sure.
I'm now busy on my masterpiece on the Book of Enoch.
Oh, wonderful!
Yeah, which is meant, again, takes in the greatest scholarship that's been available on that subject for 2,000 years and puts it in a form that the intelligent person will hopefully enjoy. And for me, it's been enlightening, and I want to pass that light on.
Well, I have to say my seventh great grandfather's name was Enox. So
you see, he won't go away.
I know, right? He will not go away, and I can't wait to see the book, and hopefully we'll have you back for that. That would be awesome.
That's great, Tony. Great delight to speak to you.
You too, and thank you everyone for being a part of Truth Be Told, and thank you guys for tuning in every Friday. Don't forget, we have coming up the Parapod Festival, March 31st through April 1st in Santa Clarita, California. It's all things paranormal, so if anything you want to see when it comes to the paranormal genre, we have everything. There are some of our guests, Billy Carson, Linda Moulton Howell, Ernie LaPont, great-grandson of Sitting Bull, Dr. Robert Schock, Jimmy Church, and the list goes on and on. You can go to parapodfestival.com to get your tickets. And we also, on March 31st, we're going to be at Mentryville Ghost Town doing stargazing and ghost town tours. So make sure you come and see us. And until next time, I'm Tony Sweeten. Please thank you guys for sharing the show, leaving great comments, and it's without you we can't keep doing this. So thank you so much for your support and making this one of the top 5% of all podcasts in the world. I appreciate you, and until next time, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye. This has been another episode of Truth Be Told. Thank you so much for watching. Recorded live at UBN Go Studios in Burbank, California. Join us on social media: Facebook, Truth Be Told Radio; Instagram, Truth Be Told Paranormal. Go to Truth Be Told Worldwide for more information on upcoming shows.